Thank you for joining Charter School Capital's webinar on facility financing. Just to kind of go over the agenda this morning or early afternoon if you're on the East Coast, we're just going to kind of go over who we are, go over kind of our experience in charter school facilities in the national and from a national real estate platform. We're going to discuss structures and approaches. We're also going to discuss a new no-cost bond option. And then at the end, we're going to have a Q&A session, and then just to kind of break up some of the presentation, we're going to ask a polling question just to kind of get some feedback from you all in regards to your facilities. And so with that, let's go ahead and get started here. My name is Mike Robinson. I am the client service representative for Charter School Capital. I cover the Southwest region, so I cover Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Nevada, as well as Minnesota, Ohio, and Indiana. And I've been with Charter School Capital for going on 4.5 years. And essentially, one of my main drives is, I'm committed to improving education for all students and families. I come from a line of educators. My wife's an educator. So whether I'm directly involved or indirectly involved, I'm always looking for ways to help improve current education situations. So that is me. And Tommy, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I'm Tommy Alberini. I've been with CSC for a little over 2 years, all on the facilities side of the business. I joined as the facilities acquisitions and underwriting manager, a role that I still hold. And I come from a more traditional real estate background, unlike a lot of other folks at Charter School Capital. However, I met with the team a little over 2 years ago and got introduced to the facilities team, as well as people like Mike and our executive team, and just fell in love with the mission, fell in love with what CSC was about, and the partners that ultimately we get to work with. So I've been loving it. It's been a really exciting journey, and we're excited to talk with you today about some of the solutions that we've been working hard to create.
Okay, so what we're going to do is talk about Charter School Capital's real estate platform. So when I look at Charter School Capital, I think of a tree with many different branches. These branches symbolize different services that we offer charter schools all across the United States. One of those branches happens to be our facility financing and support for charter schools. And just to kind of give you an idea, over the past 11 to 12 years, we have accumulated, whether through purchasing of school facilities or asset management, of over 40 different charter school facilities all across the United States. We've developed basically world-class platforms and ecosystems for our partners. And we even created a tax-exempt, no-cost bond option for charter school leaders. And this is something that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But from an asset management side, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we are the largest asset manager for school facilities in the entire country. So with that, we have a very experienced team of underwriters and financial analysts in all types of aspects of facility financing. Going to go to the next one. One of the things, because we have created this tax-exempt, no-cost bond option, there has been a lot of press about that. We essentially have done something that has never been done before in the facilities market for charter schools. And so we're getting a lot of press, whether it's the bond buyer and discussing some facilities in California or other media outlets, and discussing some of the things that not only Charter School Capital have been up to, but our partner, the wonderful foundation, which we'll discuss a little bit further on into it as well. Go to the next one. So we're going to talk about structures and approaches when looking at facilities. So as charter school leaders, whether you're on the board or whether you're executive director or whomever, or whatever your title is, There are some important factors that you need to consider when thinking about facility financing. You may have already thought about these. You may be starting to get prepared to think about these. But some of these things will come into play. Like, what is the eventual ownership? Is there any type of ownership capabilities with whatever plan that I decide to go with? What is the term length? Is it going to be a short term? Maybe give you a little bit more flexibility, or is it a long-term lease or a mortgage or a bond? So you have to kind of think about what's that term length look like. Some other things that are important to executive directors are control over building improvements. What does that look like? Who's going to be in control of those? Do you have some sort of control of your future? Are there any buyout options if you do a lease? Are you in a long-term lease, or do you have the ability to explore other options down the road? And covenants. This is a big thing that I don't think a lot of schools pay attention to in the beginning, but what type of covenants are you signing into? Sometimes it's very difficult for schools to have 35 to 45 days of cash on hand to meet certain requirements within those covenants, operational expenses or enrollment expenses, those types of things. So these are basically some of the things that we have learned over the years of what executive directors or school leaders should be looking for when considering what type of financing that they're going to go for with their facility. And obviously how school leaders should think about these factors. So with that, let's go on to the next one. Okay.
So this is.
Oh, so good, Tommy.
Oh, go ahead, Mike. No, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Okay, you're fine.
So, similar to and working off of what Mike was speaking to around all these different elements and factors that school leaders think about when making a facilities related decision. Ultimately we've boiled those down into more bundled, kind of a more formulaic approach that bundles a lot of those elements. But what it really comes down to is this concept of flexibility and stability being trade-offs, right? It's very difficult to find a solution that ultimately maximizes both of those benefits. And the traditional approach obviously applies this concept of flexibility versus stability, and that they're trade-offs. And the rationale, or what the justification is the cost, right? And ultimately school leaders and the traditional approach to charter-related decision-making is around trying to equal that cost with that either flexible or stable solution. So we've got some more kind of elaboration on these concepts, but just circling back to a lot of Mike's points that he made, flexible solutions might provide the most ability for the school to adapt or change, or expand their facility over time, or maybe relocate. Some more stable solutions are generally pretty predictable. School will understand really well what the long-term kind of destiny is for that school, whether it's a bond option that might go 30 years, and ultimately the school is going to have a really good idea of what those bond payments will be, and ultimately have some path to ownership at the end. So they're predictable, they're constant, and generally permanent. And ultimately, like we said, there's this concept of cost that applies to both of those, right? What price are you paying for either one of those benefits or solutions? And we'll touch on this a little bit later as well, but we want to roll in this concept of opportunity cost, right? And how it impacts both of these solutions. Ultimately, opportunity cost is the cost or the potential gain that's lost as a result of choosing one alternative over several others. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but I think it's something to keep in mind as we kind of refer to a lot. Okay, so moving gears to this next slide here. You can see we've got a flexibility on this y-axis and stability on this x-axis. And going forward, if in concept, what increases flexibility? Ultimately, having shorter-term lease agreements, as Mike had alluded to earlier, that would be viewed as something that is a pretty flexible solution, because it provides the school with the ability to make different decisions at the end of that near-term lease expiration. Things like buyout options, of course, provide just additional optionality to the school, which has clear value. Things like lease renewals, giving the school the ability to, at its sole discretion, renew its lease term based off pre-negotiated lease terms is pretty valuable as well. You know, these are all things that you can very easily view as flexible sort of solutions. The lack of covenants is something we'll get into later as well, but that kind of goes comparison to, or I guess it contradicts the more bond-related solutions that you might run into around having restrictions on outside capital that you can source, you know, retaining certain DSCR coverage ratios, also kind of looking in terms of liquidity and days cash on hand requirements. So we'll get into that later. But I think, you know, moving to stability, if we're kind of defining what ultimately increases stability in terms of decisions, it's the long-term ownership, which is, you know, something that a lot of schools bring up in conversations we have with schools for obvious reasons, and something that we work really hard to try and get. And I think we've created a pretty strong solution in order to be able to provide that. But things that increase stability are also longer terms, you know, ultimately solutions that are over 20 years, where the school has a really good idea of what their payments will be on an ongoing basis and how to budget for that, and just have some sort of consistency there, as opposed to, well, we're not really sure where the market's going or rates are going to go, or, you know, what kind of demand there might be for our building, so on and so forth. So I think let's shift gears to the next slide here. You know, we've got examples that we've applied to this same sort of framework. So if you take the most flexible solution you can think of, and we've brought it up a couple times now, that's really a short-term lease obligation. So this short-term lease is our first example for the most flexible solution. The most stable solution is really a self-issued bond. If a school, for those of you in the audience that have already issued their own bonds in order to support a facilities-related transaction, you're familiar with the process, you're familiar with the costs. And for those of you that haven't, you know, ultimately it's, you probably have some semblance of it being a really strong, stable solution that's going to be a long-term, have long-term validity, and ultimately end up in building ownership, which is, again, a really strong hot button that we tried to work toward altogether. In the middle of these two is a long-term lease solution. So, you know, ultimately you don't have the same restrictions in terms of the covenants that you might have with the bond. You don't have a lot of the same kind of elements that you might see with a self-issued bond in terms of the term, right? It's not quite as long. You might have renewal options that allow you to have this really long-term lease option, but it's kind of a hybrid solution of both a short-term flexible solution and this long-term sort of stable solution. Now, you can take that a step further and add buyout options to that long-term lease. So going to the next click forwards, yeah, sorry. So long-term lease options with buyout options, ultimately, these provide even more flexibility than just a traditional long-term lease. Now, what we've been able to do through partnership with Wonderful Foundations is take this even a step further and not only provide a long-term lease with buyout options, but also add in this element of being included in a tax-exempt pooled bond issuance, which allows the school to obtain a lot of the same benefits that you might see with a self-issued bond without actually having to pay for being included in that bond. Ultimately, all those costs are borne by the parties involved in the actual bond issuance. So if you go to the next slide, Britt, you can see this long-term lease option is maximizing with buyout options in the pool bond structure. So now let's go to the next slide. So how do we think about these costs? We've developed a case study here, assuming a $5 million building purchase value. And we've applied two different solutions to this case study, right? So we've got one, a traditional bond option, and two, a CSC lease option. And these are, again, just samples, but give you an idea of how the costs really do translate. So under this traditional bond option, you know, you might see, oh, wow, it's a 6% interest rate. And let's compare that with the CSC lease option at 7%. Now, what a lot of people who aren't as familiar with the bond market don't realize is there's actually a pretty significant cost of issuance associated with this bond. And that's a combination of two things. One, primarily having some sort of reserve that's needed in order to cover debt service in the event of any shortfall or the school not being able to cover, you know, certain payments in certain years at the sufficient coverage ratio. Bond buyers and bond holders like to see this reserve that's funded And it can be funded with cash if the school has it, but it's a pretty substantial amount. And if it's not funded with cash, a lot of times it is capitalized into the total bond amount. So if it's, just for another example, if it's $1 million bond and you've got 15% between this reserve amount and the cost of issuance, so that's legal fees, on bond counsels and diligence costs, ultimately a bunch of costs that go into actually getting the transaction completed, given all the 501c3 hoops and IRS tax code hoops to jump through. Ultimately, that $1 million bond could very quickly now become a $1.15 million bond. So that is a pretty big implication here as it relates to the cost of the total bond payments based off that original principal amount. A lot of times we see a 10-year lockout period. We've seen the same with our own bond issuances. So we've just applied the same concept here. And that's really just saying within the first 10 years of the bond term, it's very difficult to prepay that bond back or to pay down the principal and refinance. Ultimately, a lot of the costs might be so punitive that it wouldn't make economic sense to do so. And sometimes it's just outright not allowed. So let's move over to this next. Well, sorry, just before we do, we'll compare which one is more costly. But the concept here with the CSC lease option, now the difference is a CSC lease option is going to have 2% annual escalations as an example here. However, we've also applied these buyout options, again, providing a more flexible solution in terms of these buyout options at years 3 and 10 of the lease term. So let's move here to the next slide here, and you can see how we've kind of laid out a lot of these cost comparisons. So on the left, we've got these total annual payments, right? So this is just comparing on a year-to-year basis how the actual cost compares. So you can see the bond at $418,000 in year 1 versus the lease payment at $350,000. So the big delta here, the driver for the delta, is that 15% cost of issuance for the most part. If you compare in year 10, you see these costs about true out. They're just about equal. And then by year 18, you can see obviously the lease obligation is more costly on an annual basis. Now, to the right of this slide, you can also see the total cumulative payment. So there's quite some catch up to be done over this first 10 years. Such that ultimately the break point is actually out in year 18, sorry. So you've got just about the same amount that's gone of capital that has gone out the door and out of your operating statements for both of these solutions by year 18. And after that, obviously the lease option will be more expensive. But the point is that's 18 years of payment that equals out between a bond and lease solution. So now we'll get into more of the elements of what options there are within that 18-year period under a lease obligation and which options there are or may not be under a bond solution. So we'll go to the next slide and talk about kind of just other variables or other considerations with respect to cost, right? Dollars today being worth more than dollars tomorrow. This is a concept that we run into frequently. And ultimately, it's across the board, we see a lot of schools, and the majority of schools want to be putting those dollars that they can save today back into their system. And that's to address critical needs, that's to grow enrollment or to help retain enrollment. Those are ultimately dollars that are well spent today as opposed to saved 15 or 20 years from now. Schools want access to that sooner than later. So there's this concept of that the value of $1 being more valuable to me today if I can save it than 20 years from now. So that's kind of time value of money is a separate concept. This is really just saying the dollars we want them today. So another one is, does this structure allow for flexibility to borrow additional funds to fuel growth? A lot of times a self-issued bond will actually restrict the school's ability to go out and source its own capital from outside sources. And that's a very difficult hurdle to overcome with a lot of growth stage schools that we see. So one thing that we try and work really hard to do is to continue to free up that capital. And for those that have participated in CSC's working capital platform, I think you can see the value of having access to outside capital, outside of this sort of obligation that's due under these bond issuance restrictions. And then lastly, as you give up options, you pay an opportunity cost. So this goes back to the concept we raised earlier. I won't repeat it. Let's go to the next slide, Britt. So Let's get into this no-cost bond structure that Mike had alluded to earlier. Through partnership with these two groups, really, both Mike and I are with CSC, so we play this role of asset manager through a lot of these different transactions and just serving as a liaison to try and negotiate the best deal possible for the schools and still provide a package pool of assets that's sellable at this bond market level. We've worked with Citibank as our primary underwriter. They've been a really, really strong partner. They've got the largest municipal bond desk in the country, and they've been a fantastic group to work with, ultimately coming up with this in a lot of ways, bringing a lot of creative kind of ideas to this concept of this tax-exempt bond pooled issuance with lease fee interest, as opposed to a lot of notes that have been pooled in the past. So that's what really sets this new bond issuance apart, is it's a multi-state, multi-operator pool with tax-exempt bond issuance proceeds, and something that's just hasn't been done before. And we have to obviously give a lot of credit to our partner, the 501c3 entity Wonderful Foundations, which has been a group that was established a little over 2 years ago, solely to serve the mission of the charter school space. And ultimately, they've been a fantastic partner as well to work with. They are the new landlord under all of these assets that get rolled into these bond pool issuances. So it's Wonderful Foundations that qualifies for the 501c, the tax-exempt bond proceeds, and it's Wonderful Foundations that pays a lot of the cost of issuance and ultimately absorbs the debt service obligations. So that cost and that obligation is not borne by the schools in the pool. It is borne by Wonderful Foundations. So let's skip to the next slide here. What we've done with introducing a lot of these partners into the space is kind of flipped this formula on its head. So I think, obviously everybody remembers, this concept of flexibility versus stability equals cost. But if we kind of flip through here, you can see we've actually nixed this concept of versus and made it a plus concept, right? We've been able to create both a hybrid solution of combining flexibility and stability in order to be something greater than cost. So Britt, if you can push forward on these, you'll see plus flexibility plus stability is greater than this concept of cost. And you can keep going through to the end so we can see the notes here. But this concept of CSC managing this bond issuance process and providing no covenants or restrictions on the schools is really supportive of this concept of flexibility. And this path to ownership, by being included in a pooled issuance, the school still qualifies for the same path to ownership at the end of the bond term. And it's the intent of the foundation, assuming all the debt service payments are paid off, the same they would apply in a self-issued bond. It would be the intent of the foundation to simply gift the schools to the facilities to the schools at no cost. And that's ultimately because Wonderful Foundations is a nonprofit and there's no value to them in retaining those real estate assets in order to go and reposition or to figure out, future lease obligations. Once all of the debt service payments and principal is paid down on the bonds, there's nothing owed on them. And so even though Wonderful Foundations had carried the obligation, now they're able to pass on that benefit of ownership directly to the schools. And let's get to this concept of cost. Obviously, there's this idea that getting into the bond without incurring transaction fees is pretty valuable. Those can be pretty substantial costs. And those, in this case, those are borne by the other parties involved, not by the school. Now, we also have this concept of a modest facility expense relief being possible. So in several instances, we've been able to provide some sort of donation. Well, for the initial issuance, so what we've been able to do is create an annual giving fund, which is an annual donation that just about equals the escalations that the school would incur on the rent otherwise. So it kind of balances out over the term of the bond with what the school would see in terms of rent escalations. But the beauty in this annual giving fund is the concept that any surplus fees after Wonderful Foundations pays the debt service obligations, any surplus funds go back to the schools in some sort of donation. So that's through this wonderful annual giving fund, just annual donations, as well as this concept of a capital reserve fund. And we'll get into that later, but in theory, it's this concept that under these triple net leases, the school is obligated for the most part to pay for its own roof replacement. Under this new structure, we've found a way to be able to capitalize that amount and fund it through this bond flow of funds, and ultimately provide that benefit back to the schools, so the schools can apply for some sort of capital draw to make that replacement without having to go out of pocket themselves to do so. So let's go to the next slide, and we can get to questions here. I think you can submit them in either the chat section, or there might be a more formalized way of doing it. I don't if everyone has access to that, but I think, you know, we spent a good amount of time trying to find a solution, ultimately, as we alluded to before, with this Wonderful Foundations bond. And you know, it was something that transpired pretty quickly. There were a lot of people involved in it, and we're pretty excited about the end result. So I don't know if Mike, you want to switch gears here, if you have any questions that you want to kind of prompt or anything.
There's a question already for you, Tommy. Does the school have a buyout option? There's a question that just popped up.
Does the school have a buyout option? I'm not really sure in reference to any schools in the existing pool or in the case study that we were referring to. I'm not really sure, but I'll just go back. Britt, why don't we go back to the case study, and we can kind of reference some of those buyout options. We have, to answer that question, we have been able to include facilities and schools that, let's say it was a school that already had a buyout option. We've been able to honor those buyout options within the greater bond pool. The bond market is, let's go forward, sorry. But the bond market is open to those structures, as long as ultimately there is enough in terms of the proceeds through that buyout option to be able to pay down the outstanding principal and the cost to defease or prepay the bond. So the answer is yes, to buyout options are possible. They are kind of considered on a case-by-case basis. It really depends on the economics, and it's ultimately something that there's a close watch on by the bond market when we bring these assets to the municipal market. But for the most part, the answer to that is it's definitely possible, something we've done before, and we would absolutely consider it going forward.
So there was another question here. Tell us a little bit more about the Wonderful Foundation. As Tommy alluded to, they are a 503c company that was formed about 2 years ago. The design of the Wonderful Foundation was to, be a supportive force or entity in the charter school space. They are their own entity. They have their own board. Their goal was really to come up with different services to be able to help charter schools all across the United States. It just so happens that the bond issuance that we have helped the Wonderful Foundation complete back in August, and the new one that we're doing that should probably close at end of December or early January. This is what they are into or are working on towards right now. And then I would imagine, I can't speak for them because they're separate, that there are other things that they are looking to do in the charter school space. You can always go to the Wonderful Foundation's website. It's www.wonderfulfoundation.org, I believe. So you can touch that, or you just type in Wonderful Foundation, should pop up on your search. We do, as long as there is charter law in a state, and there are charter schools in any state, our facilities branch can work with those schools. And I've mentioned here, there's one in New York. Yes, absolutely, we can do it in New York. We can work with any schools for facilities in any state that has charter law. The next question, so Tom, this might be for you. So
yeah,
you can go down through there and see.
I can get into a lot of these. So okay. There was a question, Mike, on the cost of issuance. So ultimately, to answer that question, yes, the cost of issuance is entirely borne by Wonderful Foundations as well as the seller of the assets, and that depends on ultimately who owns the assets before they make them their way into a Wonderful Foundation solution or issuance. So ultimately, the 15% cost of issuance there that you see, that would not be an obligation, that's paid for or capitalized into the cost that's borne by the school. There's another question around states we support. Obviously, Mike had said that New York is in that. Yes. Is what's required of the school to enroll in the bond option? Ultimately, not much. It starts with a conversation, and we've now done 26 facilities that we've rolled into bond solutions. So we're pretty good at being able to sort of isolate the variables up front and figure out if it's something that would work or not. Generally, I can tell you buyout options within the first 5 to 10 years are pretty difficult, but they have been done. So that's something that a lot of schools come and they say, hey, I want a buyout option in year 2, and this is why, and we understand that, but ultimately the cost of paying down those bonds within the first 10 years is pretty exorbitant. So it makes it very difficult unless that buyout option is at a really high price in order to justify those within a really short window. However, what we have been able to kind of incorporate is this concept of, give us a couple years to try and roll it into a wonderful bond solution. And if CSE is unable to do that, then ultimately we can provide a buyout option outside of that window. There's a concept here, a question about the interest rate and escalators. So we use the term lease rate, which is, you can just use it basically the same, or apply it the same way you would an interest rate. But ultimately that is all based off, it's all determined on a case-by-case basis, right? So if you're a school with a really strong enrollment growth or enrollment retention track record, and you've got a strong set of financials, or you're operating at 1.2 times debt service coverage, and you've got what we would assume is, or what we would see as a really strong credit profile, then we're going to be able to really price that rate as low as possible. And if you're a growth stage school, we still get really aggressive on the rate because these are tax exempt bond issuance proceeds. But I think generally there's no one fixed pricing across the board for the school cost in terms of the lease rate. Everything is viewed on a case-by-case basis, and it's our job to get you the best deal possible. A lot of times that results in a rent reduction. We would not go and apply some sort of rent increase to you and in order to try and get you into the bond unless it made economic sense from some sort of buyout option scenario. So it's all about us providing potential solutions to the school, and we can do that through some sort of quote process. If a school's interested in looking at a wonderful solution, it starts with a conversation. Maybe there's the ability to acquire the facility and roll it into a bond. There was a question around timing. Generally, you should assume between 3 and 6 months from the time that CSC acquires the facility with one of its partners. And that's important because it's very difficult, unless you have a really, really flexible seller, to simply roll these properties straight into a bond issuance. A lot of times it takes some interim sort of bridge solution to be able to acquire the asset and then prep it for the bond and then roll it in. It's subject to market kind of fluctuations in pricing, and there are a lot of elements that sort of play into that. Mike, there are some other questions here. I don't know if you want to address any of them. There was one around currently looking at a facility that the owner would like to sell. It's a $2.5 million project and needs about $2.5 million for repair and renovation. So
yes, go ahead, Tom.
This is totally in our wheelhouse. Something that has a significant expansion or renovation component to it is a really good candidate for the bond market. And a lot of that has to do with, ultimately, a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's this value add component, right? It's a really, really great story to tell a bond investor that, hey, we've got this school who's, working really hard to grow enrollment, but they need seats, they need additional capacity. And this is how we get them there. And this is why it's affordable. So that narrative allows us to go and sell that to the municipal bond market and roll a property like that directly in. Now, there's another solution to, again, charter school capital looks at expansion opportunities and development opportunities pretty frequently. So if it's something that, again, requires this sort of bridge solution, it's absolutely something that CSC can help coordinate and provide capital for. Sorry, Mike, I cut you
Yeah,
off.
no,
I don't
no.
know
I
if
was just going to, you actually just answered the question that I saw there. And as far as if the schools were responsible for ongoing maintenance, yeah, the leases that we enter into with schools is a triple net lease. So they're responsible for the maintenance, the insurances, any taxes that are that apply, if there are any taxes that apply to that particular situation. As far as options for new charter schools, typically we like to have at least a couple of years of history with the school. We to be able to come into the facility financing branch of what we do. But doesn't mean that, we can always look at anything that's out there. Doesn't mean that that's always a set no. It's just that's kind of what the typical scenario is. Can it be new construction? Typically, we like to purchase existing facilities, school facilities that they're already in, maybe that the landlord wants to sell. We can purchase existing buildings and do tenant improvements to that. From a new construction standpoint, we look at those opportunities on a case-by-case basis. We have financed new construction in the past. It's just that we're not the general contractor with it. So we just need to, there's just other variables that we need to make sure that are covered to make something like that happen. But yes, we have done that in the past for charter schools across the country. And our facility improvements, the last question here, it looks like our facility improvements fundable from capital reserve fund as opposed to just major maintenance renovations. Tommy, you probably have a little bit more knowledge on that one. I would assume, I'm not going to assume because that would be wrong of me, but from your experience of what you've seen so far, how does that look?
Yeah, I think we've gotten this question a few times in the past, and ultimately the capital reserve fund is really set out to provide, capital for renovations and repairs, right? So, well, not more so really just repairs and maintenance, I should call it. So, ultimately it's not something that would be best suited unless there was a bunch of excess capital in the capital reserve. So, and that's the tough part is it's hard to tell, maybe we've got, for instance, we've got a little over $20 million in the initial pooled issuance capital reserve fund. So that's almost 10% of the total bond issuance. It's a significant amount, but it's a 40-year bond term. So you have to assume that ultimately schools will need a new roof within that 40 years. And the capital reserve fund is structured such that, it's ultimately at the discretion based off these applications from schools. It's at the discretion of the Wonderful Foundations board to ultimately apply that capital and steward it in the best way possible. So, responsibly thinking, they're going to be prioritizing a lot of those repairs and maintenance items over, an expansion component, or, I'd like to, paint my school or get a new sign for out front, more cosmetic elements. But that being said, and this goes back to this kind of concept again of flexibility and stability, if we're taking this y-axis of flexibility, ultimately being able to have your receivables not liened, being able to have access to outside capital, ultimately the schools are subject to the terms of the lease agreement and nothing else. There is no sort of obligation that they have to pay debt service payments. There's no cross collateralization across the schools within the pool. There was another question about that. If one school defaults on its rent payment, they're defaulting under the terms of the lease, but that school is not implicating some other school with respect to their ability and ultimately their ability to stay in good standing with the landlord and within the greater pool. So, it's not gonna impact your ability to access the capital reserve fund or the other donations. Ultimately, these are all the schools are subject just to the terms of their individual lease agreements, and Wonderful Foundations has assumed the obligations associated with the bond as its sole itself. It's the only entity that assumes those responsibilities. So I think, again, being able to have that flexibility component within this greater bond, right? Ultimately, CSC could help find and source capital, which we've done in the past, if you do want an interim, kind of expansion component addressed within the lease term or whatever you've got there.
That kind of goes to the scalability function of our facility financing, that there is scalability there. So your lease can grow with you as your school grows. So if there are capital improvements of adding more classrooms and things like that, those things can be added into the lease as well for you as you start moving and growing as well. So there is a scalability function of our lease that is very flexible. And of course, you'll have, because there are no restrictions, there are accesses to capital that you can also gain access to be able to fund those improvements as well, whether it's through us or through somebody else. So that's something to always keep in mind in regards to that. I believe that was all of the questions that we were able to see. So I hope we answered everything. If not, just some next steps. If it's something that you're interested, obviously, speak with your board, share this information with them. If you love where you're at and maybe want to explore this opportunity, maybe talk with your landlord, introduce them to us. Maybe we can help realize that the landlord may want to sell the facility, and then we can have you as part of our team as well. And then, or just connect with us to find out whether your school might qualify for a path for ownership through the no-cost bond option, or just even if your school might save money through our leaseback solution. So as we started going through this and after the Wonderful Foundation, we can't always say that every school will see a savings from their leases, but from what we've seen so far, there has been some savings there for schools to realize to be able to put back into their classroom. So that's always positive for us to see. Go ahead. And with that, I believe that's the end. I hope you enjoyed it. Please, if you have any questions, reach out to Tommy or myself. We have our emails right below. You'll be getting a copy of this presentation as well so that you can share. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was informative. I know that we are excited about the evolution of facility financing for charter schools. We believe that we believe that we've kind of tapped into an offer here for schools to look at different things that maybe what they normally would, but we're excited nonetheless, and hope that we have the opportunity to talk to you guys in the future. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.